Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Great Lakes Green Chemistry, Michigan Green Chemistry Clearinghouse webinar. I'm Lynn Katz-Cherry, the Executive Director of the Great Lakes Green Chemistry Network, and we also have with us Clinton Boyd from the Michigan Green Chemistry Clearinghouse. Our presenter today is Jim Kleinschmit, who is currently the Director of Climate and Energy Initiatives at the Institute for Agriculture and Trade Policy in Minneapolis. Jim works with farmers and rural citizens to capture opportunities for rural revitalization through increased local leadership capacity, sustainable resource management, new market creation, and community-based development. Jim founded IATP's Rural Community Programs in 2008 and developed and still oversees IATP's Working Landscapes Certificates program, which promotes sustainable farming practices tied to the bioplastic sector. He now leads IATP's overall work on energy and climate with a specific focus on impacts and opportunities for farmers and rural communities worldwide. Jim, as I'm sure you'll hear, grew up milking cows and learning about sustainable farming and rural organizing from his parents on their now organic farm in northeast Nebraska. He has an MA from the Jackson School of International Studies at the University of Washington, Seattle, and a BA from St. Olaf College in Northfield, Minnesota. He is a regular presenter and keynote speaker on issues of sustainable agriculture, bioplastics, biofuels, and climate change, and I must say that he was a presenter at one of the workshops that IATP and the Great Lakes Green Chemistry Network collaborated on, tools for business, green chemistry tools for business, on this subject in Ohio last spring, and it was extremely interesting and very well received by the audience, by the workshop participants. So we're very happy to welcome him today, and I'm going to turn it over to you, Jim.
Great. Thank you, Lynn, and thank you, Clinton. And thank you all for participating in the webinar. It's my privilege to be able to talk with you today about some of the things that we see around sustainability concerns and opportunities for biopolymer, bioplastic type feedstocks. So, but first I feel like I should probably tell you a little bit about IATP, the Institute for Agriculture and Trade Policy, where I work. We're now, I think, a 27 or 28-year-old organization, and we were founded during the farm crisis, really to work with farm communities around the world to come up with better solutions on both the policy and the practice level. Here's our mission statement now. We work at the intersection of policy and practice to ensure fair and sustainable food, farm, and trade systems for all people. So that's really the broad kind of mission we work within, and that's the broad perspective I bring organizationally. But we also tie with other organizations, and in particular around things like biomaterials. We've found it very important to work with groups that look at the entire life cycle, and so we joined together with some other groups to form the Sustainable Biomaterials Collaborative a number of years ago, an informal organization that really is focused on spurring the introduction use of biomaterials that are sustainable from cradle to cradle, and looking at the kind of markets, sustainability guidelines, policy initiatives, and tools that can help advance and develop this the sustainable biomaterials economy. So that's our broader context, and as usual, like many organizations, we do our best to work with partners, and so groups like the Institute for Local Self-Reliance, Clean Production Action, the Lowell Center for Sustainable Production, and so on. We have a number of groups that are very involved, including Clinton. So that's my organizational perspective, both directly and then the collaborative we work with. But as Lynn had pointed out, of course, I have my own perspective I bring as well. And this is our family farm in Nebraska. And for me, that's really where a lot of where I learned about sustainable agriculture, and from both an ethics perspective and a practical perspective. And it still informs my work to this day, as I've seen my family do their own transition from a relatively conventional, diversified farm still, to something that's really focused on organic production, on sustainability from a perennial perspective. We have solar panels. So my family has really made a journey that has helped inform my perspective on all of this work as well. So here's ITB's perspective on specifically on sustainable bioeconomy, and it's why an organization that's focused on food and farms gets involved with bioplastics, because we think a sustainable bioeconomy really is key to our future and is possible because it can provide the food, fuel, fiber, and materials we need. We're clear about the need, not the want, being the key word there. We think a sustainable bioeconomy can result in much safer products and processes, and it's something that I know listeners to the webinars from Lynn and the Green Chemistry Network understand the goals and values there that we share. It protects and enhances the environment and climate. It can benefit farmers, rural communities, and society, and is fair and responsive to societal needs. We think those are all key principles for moving forward a bioeconomy that actually is sustainable. So let's start talking bioplastics specifically. And as you see here, we've got what in many cases are the most common feedstocks for bioplastics. And the question, of course, is why? Why would these be the main crops, the main sources of bioplastics today? At the same time, we have emerging bioplastic feedstocks, and you see these are different materials. In fact, some of it are residues or residues from trees or from forest products. Others are more perennial type grasses and bamboo. Again, the question is why would we go to these? And I think the answers are pretty self-evident. Sorry, went ahead. From an agricultural perspective, this industry is still relatively early in its development, and so when it got started, it went to the crops that were the most common. What were those? It was back to these the common feedstocks that we see across our food, feed, and industrial product sector. We use sugarcane for ethanol and other products. Corn, similarly. Wheat and potatoes are very common products that farmers know how to grow, we have infrastructure for, and which industry knows how to turn into valuable products and has the resources to do so in the research. Not as much yet for some of these, although obviously it's growing and it's emerging very quickly with several of them. But we see these emerging bioplastics also out of feedback, often not so positive, about using these first-generation feedstocks, many of which are also food or feed products, as we know. And so the idea is to move towards both higher value products from an environmental perspective, but also to get away from some of the concerns people have about competition with the food system. I'll talk about those issues as we go forward. So let's start with agricultural feedstocks. That's really the area, obviously, with our name having Institute for Agriculture and Trade Policy, where we focus the most. So that's where I'll spend my time. What are the concerns? The concerns are the same as we have for agricultural production in general. There's always questions about soil, water, and air quality, about the level of fossil fuel and energy use, although that obviously has a higher concern in an area like bioplastics, where we're really looking at substituting or greatly reducing fossil fuel use. Biodiversity and wildlife impacts from the crop production itself, global warming concerns associated with it, farm worker safety and benefit, and then, as I already alluded to, the food security impacts. What is the primary feedstock of today's bioeconomy? It's still corn, at least in the U.S. It's the primary ingredient for both fuel and for biofuels and for bioplastics. What do we have? Why are we doing it? Why are we using corn? Well, we produce a lot of it, and we're planting more and more of it. I used to say we're growing more and more of it a couple of years ago, but with the recent drought of 2012, and again, volatile weather conditions in the last year, that's not always the case. Although, as you can see from the chart here on corn and soybean planted acreages, we continue to increase that level, and that has increased. So these are the crops that we grow the most, and we're planting more and more of them, even if we may not always get the same high yields of those. I will say I don't have 2013 numbers up here. I did. They haven't all been finalized that I can tell. But there was an increase in corn production again. We went back, we increased significantly, back up almost 14 billion bushels, which was about a 25% increase from 2012's drought years, which is reflected in the map I show you. So with the Corn Belt getting hit, it was a problem. So these are feedstocks that we know how to grow, that are supported under farm policy, and that we have the infrastructure to handle. So this is a pretty obvious point of why we would go towards these crops, at least initially, for bioplastic feedstocks. And why grow so much corn? I alluded to some of this, but let's not. It's not because farmers just want to grow more and more corn on their own, that it's a pure desire. It's obviously based on economics. Farming is a business decision. And what they grow is determined by policy and markets, as all agricultural economics are. And corn has been deeply invested in from both perspective of multiple markets. You can always sell corn from an agricultural perspective. It doesn't matter where it goes, as long as it's the right quality. It can be sold, and it will be used in multiple markets, whether it's a food market, a feed market, a fuel market, a bioplastics market, food additives, or so on. At the same time, our policy has developed very sophisticated risk mitigation tools specifically associated with corn, soybean, and other annual crop production. That includes crop insurance programs that you've heard a lot about with the recent passage again of the Farm Bill, but other kinds of systems as well that really are intended to, from a research perspective, for getting funding out there for new hybrids, all the way through to the production and harvesting and marketing support. It's something that farmers have support from a policy perspective on and have reduced risk as a result of. So here's estimated corn uses. I have 2010, 2011 up here. The reality is it hasn't shifted dramatically since then. We've had a leveling off in some ways of the really enormous growth in ethanol production that has brought it back not far off these levels. So I didn't go in and shift everything dramatically. But we're still about half and half between corn and feed residual uses, and I will just clarify that that 39% that's highlighted for feed and residual is U.S. use. There's an additional 14% of exports, which we assume the vast majority of goes to feed as well, but it's not tracked at that same level. So, there's over 50% of the corn is still likely, more than likely, going into feed. There's also a percentage of the ethanol corn. We have to remember with any of this kind of industrial production, we're generally using just a part of the corn in our production, and that's true for ethanol. It's true for bioplastics. In those cases, we're taking the sugar side, the carbohydrate side, and the protein and the fats and other oils are still left behind, called commonly distiller grains or distiller grains and solubles. And that is almost always sold back into the feed market, and that constitutes about a third of the total corn volume. So even of that 40%, you can assume that a third of that 40% that's going to ethanol, the protein and the fats and other stuff is going back into the feed system. But there's no denying that we obviously have had a huge shift where there's a significant percentage of our corn not going directly to feed anymore, even once you take the protein, fat, the distiller grain part away. Bioplastics, on the other hand, remain a minuscule amount comparably. While the use has been growing, it continues to be barely register on a U.S. chart of this sort. And so while we talk about food security concerns with bioplastics, and people often raise that question, there's not a direct effect. But there is a reality here, and it comes down to more about questions of land. We know that increasing demand for food and bioeconomy needs make any new demand felt. So we look at any use as something that potentially is increasing the cost of corn in the food and feed markets where it has its most negative impacts for poorer populations in other parts of the world. So the issue of food versus fuel or bioplastic is generally more about land use than specific crops. It's not about necessarily about this corn not making it to making it into a food market, but it does have an impact on what crops are grown. And if we have high demand for corn, which we've seen both for ethanol and for feed and for other uses, then by definition that incentivizes farmers to grow more corn, and which results in less other crops being grown, which often does have a direct impact on food. So there is an impact. Now, I say it's about land. Now, that could change with drought and volatile weather. It could be actually about crops themselves. We've gotten quite low in our supplies in the U.S., our carryover supplies over the last couple of years. So we do get to points where we do get a very low supply available, but so far it hasn't seemed to have that kind of direct connection that people look at from a food and a bioplastic perspective. So what are the concerns about corn? Well, one of it is, what do we put into corn? Corn is one of the most intensive crops we grow. We average over 120 pounds of nitrogen fertilizer per acre. We have among the highest levels of herbicide and pesticide use for any conventional crops that we grow in certain parts of the country. irrigation is critical and essential for corn production, and we use a lot of it, especially down in western Nebraska and some of those areas around the Ogallala. And then there's the question of proprietary hybrids, where the question of intellectual property is one of the inputs as well, because companies invest huge sums of money in developing new varieties, and then obviously retain ownership of those. And so that's one of the inputs there as well that often is not necessarily talked about. But we produce a lot of corn, as you know. I already talked about what we produce for corn, but there's other stuff produced as well, unfortunately. Soil erosion, nutrient runoff, and leaching result from a lot of the corn, from some of the corn production, especially when it's when it's very intensive and has little crop rotation involved. We can have a lot more of that. We have water, air, soil, health, and biodiversity impacts of some of the chemicals and the GMO uses. We have greenhouse gas emissions associated with the fertilizer, the synthetic fertilizer that's used, some of the fuel used, and the fossil fuels used within the actual production of the corn itself, and from emissions from the soil as it's being tilled. We have pressure on ecosystems and land uses, some of which I've already alluded to from other crop perspectives, but we also have been, it also has had a lot of pressure on what remaining natural or native land, native prairie and wetlands and such. We have still in a lot of the corn belt and agricultural land. We've seen a significant decline in some of those key conservation kind of land in the last number of years as corn prices have been higher. And then we see, and this is the one that obviously has even, it may surprise people, but we see a reduced rural economic benefit from some of this agricultural production with higher concentration of production and land ownership. We're seeing that producers often are not, that the value, the benefits of that production may not always be shared back within the community. While I will say most farmers still, most farms are family farms, even if they're quite large, and farmers and families do participate in their community and do what they can to support them and buy what they can there. There's a scale issue that comes into play where a lot of the purchases, a lot of the inputs, a lot of the expenditures may not be, may be large enough to actually have them not engage with local businesses in their community, which means those dollars are not being circulated in their own economy as much. So the reality, though, is it can be different. Commodity crop production can be a part of a sustainable farming system. It does not need to be something that has these negative environmental or social impacts. But to do that, markets and policies need to be able to support it. So what we're here to talk about somewhat is how do we address some of these feedstock concerns, specifically in the bioplastic sector. I've talked a little about some of the context of it, context of our foreign policy, of the agricultural economy. Now we can turn more to this question of how do you bring feedstock sustainability into an area like bioplastics, especially when, as you know, the industry is just emerging still. I mean, especially when we started our work with bioplastics. As I mentioned, the feedstock use is actually relatively low compared to a lot of the other sectors, and initial costs are higher than fossil fuel competitors, costs and prices. What are ways to actually bring sustainability considerations within an economical way? For us, what we put forward was a program we named the Working Landscape Certificate Program. And this was a program designed to address these concerns within the bioplastic world. It was specifically created to enable bioplastic customers at different levels, whether it was the producer of the material, the product itself, a cup or something, or the actual end user who put something in it, for example, if it's packaging. But it was to enable those companies to support more sustainable farming and land use practices associated with their bioplastic use. Instead of having a direct sourcing requirement, recognizing that the processing of the feedstock was done in a facility, a large facility that handled produced multiple products and handled huge volumes of corn, much higher than what is going into the bioplastic sector. The idea of doing a direct run was prohibitive and logistically in other ways, and so this was an appropriate place to look at an offset approach, because what we understood was the major concern of customers, consumers, and others, including our own organization, were the landscape impacts of that corn production, the stuff I've mentioned already, erosion, biodiversity impacts, chemical use, and so on. We did not feel the concern was as strong about the actual GMOs being converted into the bioplastics. In our discussions with green chemists and others who have really followed this process, there was agreement that the higher concern was really out on the land. And so while by all means we would support and like to have more direct sourcing of more sustainable corn to be turned into products, this offset approach was really an essential and affordable way to start it out that still addressed the primary concerns of companies and consumers without requiring the identity preserve infrastructure and additional transaction costs, which would have made it probably cost prohibitive to the companies interested in the program. So what are the corn production criteria we have farmers follow? Here they are. We start with non-GMO. We've always had a focus on non-GMO here, recognizing the concerns that are there about GMO impacts on biodiversity, on the land, and potentially otherwise through the system. We strongly support crop rotations, and as long as crop rotations as possible, recognizing the value they bring for soil health and pest resistance and otherwise. So we prohibit continuous cropping, meaning the farmers cannot grow corn year after year on the same field. They have to rotate it with at least one crop. We require soil testing and fertilization according to criteria in the state that the farmer grows, and test results from their own soil tests and any kind of other kinds of precision equipment they have. And so we make sure that they're actually applying appropriate levels of nutrients based on actual information, not expectations of yield or expectations of need. We prohibit use of any known human or animal carcinogenic chemicals, and that's a list. We have and then we also recommend reduced or non-use of known endocrine disruptors or mutagenics, and that was all stuff that we focused on from the beginning. We work with the Pesticide Action Network to actually keep our list current, and in addition to these, we also have always had a program restriction. Prohibition on the use of atrazine for obvious concerns that have been raised about its impacts on human and animals. We require use of cover crops, or at least 70% of residues left in the field. This is really getting at the question of protecting the soil and providing nutrients back. So we don't want farmers taking every last bit of that corn crop off, taking the corn itself and the cobs maybe, but leaving most of the plant there to build soil matter. And then so there's a few other criteria specifically for the corn production, but we also recognize that, well, as important as that corn production is itself, there's broader issues that are needed to be addressed on a whole farm basis. So we, in addition to these criteria, we have a whole farm plan, WLC farm plan, that our farmers have to fill out that includes questions about what they're doing across their farm around biodiversity, around greenhouse gases and climate change, pollinator protection, energy use, and so on. And that's really to ensure that we've got the best information available on their overall farming system, not just the snapshot of how they're producing this corn in a certain year. What are the goals? Well, first and foremost is that farmers actually benefit from this. They receive a higher and more stable price for sustainable production. But we want to see, in addition to that, that very specific benefit to the farmers, we want to see a growth in the production of sustainable feedstocks for food or non-food uses. We want to see, in concert with that, a growth of markets for sustainable production. We need to see more markets that give incentives and support farmers in producing crops in a sustainable way. And then, our longer-term goal is that this helps farmers move towards perennial biomass feedstocks, which we think have a potential for much, much higher environmental, climate, and other values. I will say we've got, when we talk about receiving a higher, more stable price, our farmers in the program receive $100 per acre for their production in payment. That covers all of their, that's the incentive payment. They get to sell the corn into the market for market prices. That has been that focus on an acre basis for our incentive rather than a per bushel, an amount basis. It was very intentional to limit overproduction issues, which is where you often end up with a lot more of the pollution. And if you incent higher production, you will you will get higher production generally. So this was a way of really getting at some of the at helping farmers to grow these crops at the level that's appropriate for their resources, for their soil resources, for their actual system. It has also been a huge risk mitigator for them, especially as our farmers, so the farmers that produce for the Working Landscape Certificate Program are located in Nebraska and Iowa, not too far from the Missouri River. And in 2011, we had some of the worst flooding we've ever seen, or I've ever seen in my lifetime in the last 40 years or so along the Missouri. And then in 2012, as I showed in that map, we had some of the worst drought that's ever hit that area, or hit that area for a very long time. And this per acre basis payment has really helped these farmers to reduce their risk with the entire program. They still managed to produce a very good corn crop across, averaged out across the farms, but certain farms were hit, and the fact that they were paid on an acre basis and incentive really helped ensure that they were able to keep farming and to stay with this kind of a sustainable production system. So WLCs in the market. We started this program in the early 2000s when NatureWorks and bioplastic, corn-based bioplastic PLA was really emerging in the market. But WLCs really got their biggest lift starting in 2010 when Stonyfield yogurt became the first major WLC buyer. And you see these multi-pack products, and you see them in your grocery stores, of course. All of those that are, pretty much all of those multi-packs are made from PLA. And they purchase WLCs to offset the corn used in all of them each year. The program expanded in 2011 to Danone Germany, a partner of Stonyfield, and they started using it as well. And then in 2012, IATP began partnering with Nebraska Farmers Union to run the WLC program, which is a fantastic relationship and foundational piece for us because it allows us to allows IATP to continue to focus on strengthening the standard and the certification aspects while we have while Farmers Union is able to focus on recruiting farmers and sharing technical information and so on. So it has really been helpful to make sure that we've got a ready and willing group of farmers that are interested in this preferred market. Now, in 2012, we had over 2,000 acres of production, which, if people understand corn farming, is not a huge amount of corn, but it's equivalent to almost 1 billion yogurt cups. So from a perspective of production of bioplastic and material, it does result in something significant. And I will say for the farmers, that is something they're very proud of, that they've been connected to this kind of level of production, something that they see as a preferred product. And so, 1 billion yogurt cups in 2,000 acres, that's quite a bit for that much corn. So it's been a really good relationship for us. So you probably are aware that there's been huge interest growing over the last number of years in non-GMO production. We see it around the labeling battles that have happened in California and Washington State, Vermont, other states. But we're also seeing it just in the media on a regular basis. We see companies from General Mills and Cheerios to others making commitments to being non-GMO. For us, we see it something as a validation of our long-term commitment to non-GMO from a sustainability perspective. And for us, we're really focused, we're really excited about the growth of this market, but we want to make sure that, the food and feed and other uses of non-GMO follow some of the same kind of criteria that we're looking at for WLC, because non-GMO we think is definitely better than a GMO seed variety, but it does not guarantee that you'll have a more sustainable production system. And so we think it's really important as this market reemerges, basically, it reemerges out there that we focus on these kind of sustainability concerns like we talk about. So we think WLC is really non-GMO plus. And the fact we have a program that includes a third-party certification system, all of our farms are third-party certified, means that this may be a viable mechanism for looking at some of these other non-GMO plus kind of markets as well. And you see, for us, we see it as valuable because of the connections we have to farmers and farm organizations too. So So that's where we're at today. Obviously, there's a strong interest in moving beyond the first generation feedstocks. And as I'd mentioned, it's really, biomass has been a very strong area of focus for a lot of the companies, researchers, and so on. And there's good reasons for that. I mean, whether it's perennial grasses themselves, fast-growing trees, or crop and forest residues that, for course, should be sustainably harvested. All those materials would perform much better under a life cycle assessment and may have lower impacts potentially in a lot of the categories that we concern ourselves around agricultural crops. And one of the big ones, of course, being food security, because people are, would obviously not have the concern that this is something that was competing with food. That said, while we needed policies and the right markets for bioplastics with these other feedstocks, in this case, with biomass, we also have to deal with an infrastructure challenge. We're still not set up to handle biomass in the same way we are grains, oilseeds, and other crops. And so we need a lot more investment. Some of that's been happening around energy, in the energy sector, but we need a lot more of it if we really want to start moving in that direction from a bioplastic feedstock as well. And I think we have to be clear. What I was saying about making sure this, with non-GMO not necessarily being more sustainable, it's true about biomass production too. While perennials should be much better, do not require replanting, don't require as much fertilizer, shouldn't need as much, as much protection from pests and so on. We also know that if what we're after is high production levels, high yield, we tend to lower sustainability values, and that means using more fertilizer, over-harvesting of the kind of the biomass crops or the residues in a way that inhibits environmental values. And I'll say, from a perspective of switchgrass, one of the most often noted crops when we think about perennial grasses, some of the studies that are talking about being able to get enough, a good yield of switchgrass, talk about using similar amounts of nitrogen fertilizer as what's being used in corn. So while we do think they can be better and should be better, it's not guaranteed to be so. We really still need sustainable production and management systems to ensure those desired outcomes. So with that, I'm done, and I'm open to questions.
Wow, Jim, thank you so much. I was riveted to every screen, actually. That was so interesting. Well, we have plenty of time for questions now, so I want to encourage people to type their questions into the question box. And while we're waiting for people to get started, usually we have a slow start and then we get a deluge of questions. I have a couple questions of my own, so I'll take advantage of this little lull to ask you some of those. So I have two questions. The first one is, what do you anticipate will be the impact on farmers, and do you see it sort of a transition in crops if there is a greater emphasis on the second generation biomass, especially like increased use of, say, bamboo, which I think doesn't need as much fertilizer, if I'm correct. So that's one question. What would be the impact, or is that something that is so far in the future that we don't have to worry about it? And the second one is, what kinds of work has been done, and what kinds of alternatives to nitrogen fertilizers and pesticides do your farmers use, and do you promote for them?
Great questions, Lynn. I think the answer to the first one is not that far off. In fact, we've got, in this recently passed Farm Bill, one program did survive that we've been supportive of, even though it hasn't always, achieved its legislative goals. And it's called the Biomass Crop Assistance Program, BCAP, B-C-A-P. And this is a program, the only program that I've ever known of that was created to help farmers grow some of these new crops we need. It specifically gives financial support to farmers in designated project areas. And what's nice about this program is that it ties together a facility that needs the material and a group of farmers, landowners, that it will produce it, so that we don't have the typical chicken and egg kind of issues, which arise around new crops and new production, where if you don't, farmers won't grow something if there's not a market for it, and people can obviously invest hundreds of millions of dollars in many cases in a new facility to use a crop that doesn't exist yet in any quantity. And so this was a program that was intended to answer that question and to provide farmers with support to get some of those crops out there. I'll say when it got first introduced back in 2008, 2009, it didn't go off so well. It didn't have the focus the way it should have, and the expenditures. But we still think it has a huge value, and we were excited to see it got funding again this time around. And I think that's an acknowledgement that these are some of the crops that farmers and industry are looking for. For farmers, I'll say, there will be some challenges directly, today's farmers, in some cases learning how to grow some of these crops, but in more cases I'd see it'd be infrastructure, logistics, equipment. Farmers have in many cases narrowed down to just equipment for corn, soybeans, or wheat, or what have you. Very few crops. So having that equipment or having access to other farmers, working with other farmers who have such equipment to harvest these crops will be one of the issues. But I think if there's a market there, a clear market, and there's signals that they will continue to be demand for these crops, especially considering their environmental value in a crop rotation, my hope would be that we would see crop rotations that would include corn, soybeans, or other small grains, and some of these biomass crops over a 5 or 7 year period, which that itself gets at the answer to your second question, would help a lot. We know crop rotations, especially when they are diverse and bring in legumes, which bring nitrogen out of the air and put it in the soil, and some of these small grains, cover crops, which provide that same kind of nitrogen support. Things like that really reduce the need for synthetic fertilizer inputs, or any fertilizer inputs in some cases, but also break up pest and disease cycles in a significant way. So the need for insecticides and herbicides is often much lower. And that's especially true when we're talking cover cropping and some of the continuous living cover systems. So that's some of the ways, and that's one of the highest ways that are, one of the best ways our farmers actually just don't need to use many of the same chemicals. In other cases, we help them identify which tools are out there, some of which are organic type products, but often are not, but which seem to have lower impacts from a toxicity perspective. And that's, again, information we gain and benefit from the work of Pesticide Action and other groups that really focus in on those issues.
That's great. Thank you. Well, we do have a lot of questions now. So the first one is, what concerns do you have about sugarcane from Brazil, and how does that compare to GMO corn from the USA?
That's a great question. They're different, of course. And very different. I think for us, we tend to see, I think sugarcane. There's a lot of stuff there. So sugarcane from Brazil is produced either in a very mechanized or in a very labor-intensive way, and it's not fun labor. And so there's issues there on both cases where, on the one hand, the labor conditions are so bad that you have a lot of human rights concerns in some cases. Now the sugarcane industry is moving away from that towards mechanized production almost entirely, with all their new production being planned. But that has its own problems in that you now have a loss of jobs, and it's a little catch-22, of course, because they're not good jobs, but they are among the only jobs for some of these communities down there. So there's some human rights and labor issues associated with sugarcane in general, not that they couldn't be surmounted. I think there's other benefits, obviously. Sugarcane ethanol or sugarcane production can and often and generally does require lower fertilizer and has higher output in many cases. But so I guess I don't really, so that's how sugarcane is. And obviously, it's something that they're looking to export as a feedstock material for biofuels, but or a finished product as biofuels, but also for bioplastics, and for especially things like the green PET and so on. GMO corn, Well, it's what we produce here. It's most of the corn right now. We would like to see it shifted away from GMO. It has its own standalone concerns, as I laid out. I don't think, as I think the better answer maybe is going back to what I was saying at the end, that rather than trying to pick a crop, you need the bigger picture of the overall farm and cropping system to understand how it fits together. And so I think they both have, real problems in the way they're generally produced. There's other problems with sugarcane as well. There's many I already laid out for corn production in the intensive way it's often grown. But I know both can be produced in more sustainable ways as well. And so I think rather than saying one or the other, I think finding the more sustainable feedstock and feedstock production system is key.
Okay. Yeah, sugarcane isn't one of the problems the destruction of the rainforest in order to clear land to grow the sugarcane?
Most of it's not actually being grown there, I'll say. They're pretty good about not expanding directly into Amazon, from my understanding and my visit there. That's more cattle and other kinds of production that moves there, and soybean in particular. But it's still tied to some of that, certainly. But I don't think it's a direct relationship as much.
Okay. So, great talk. Developing bioplastics requires two fields to quote-unquote talk to each other that have previously had little interaction, polymers and agriculture. What are some of the challenges that this presents? Are there challenges in using common language or understanding different priorities?
Great question. And it's exactly right. The question puts in that we do have to have these worlds talk to each other, just like we generally have these issues of someone taking a material and throwing it over a wall to somebody else. It happens in traditional chemistry as well. And in this case, it's a big issue because I'll say, you may have sensed that one of the principles we drive towards in agriculture is diversity. Diversity generally supports more resiliency in face of volatile weather, too much water, too little water, pests, disease, so on. Diversity is a great defense against that. Diversity of feedstock and materials, of course, the reverse of what you want when you're trying to make something. And we're clear about that conformity and consistency is what engineers and chemists and others really desperately need. And so that's one of those questions. How do you find an alignment there? Because the exact same corn kernel produced the exact same way over and over and over again probably is a goal of a chemist from a materials perspective, or maybe not corn kernel, but whatever that product is. Can we come up with those same type materials, those same consistent materials produced from diverse feedstocks? That's probably the kind of the huge unanswered question that would bring these worlds together. Agriculture farmers grow crops to spec. They have always done this, right? We've always done it for the food, feed, and other markets. So we know how to do it. We can grow things according to moisture, different kinds of nutrient content, and so on. But this bigger question of what conversations have to occur is really essential, because these questions of diversity, these questions of management systems, these questions of how that impacts the final product are really important for us to understand on the farm side, and vice versa. Obviously, these needs of diversity and different crops, different feedstocks, different impacts on the land are really essential for the chemists on the other end to know when we're talking about differences in the consistency of the feedstock. I hope that answers.
I think that was good. She can ask a follow-up, if you want to. The next question is if you would expand on the third-party audit review process.
Yeah, so what we have done is we've accredited, currently we have 2 organic certifiers. Their primary work is doing certification in the organic sector. But we knew they had, they both had the basic, they had the criteria for, or the conditions for being inspectors in general, and so we accredited them on the working landscapes criteria, which means they understand all of the details of it, and they understand which pieces farmers have to follow and how their answers impact that audit. The farmers all do the production, they sign up, at the end of the production year, we schedule an audit, a visit by the auditors to every one of the farms, where they will get all of the records from the farm on that year's production. They will get access to the field. They get access to the corn storage if it's still on the farm, and they do the verification of documents, of inputs, and so on directly. And then that certification is sent to us, and then we verify it and then certify the farm as meeting the WLC criteria.
Okay. I think that is all of our questions, but there is still time for somebody to take advantage of having Jim right here to answer another question if you want, and I think it's a great opportunity. So, but Jim, this has really been a fantastic discussion, and on the website, on your website, is there a place where people can learn more about some of the things that you've been discussing and more about the certification program?
There is some information on our website if you do a search for working landscape certificates. I will say it's not as up-to-date as this presentation has been, and so there's some information there. We are actively working. We've been involved in the certification work for this last year, so we've been a little busy lately. But if anyone has any questions beyond the information there, please don't hesitate to send me an email at jimk@iatp.org.
That's great. And I guess I'll finish off with my last question that I've raised to you in the past, and I'm still kind of interested in exploring. It's probably, I mean, I'm sure it's way too big to go into in any detail, but how do you see in the future ways that, efforts in green chemistry and efforts in the field of agriculture can work together more, maybe more directly, or where efforts in green chemistry can really support the kind of work that you're trying to do, maybe beyond the obvious of, finding alternative to these nitrogen fertilizers and pesticides, but on a broader scale?
Well, I think one of the most important things is we know that, so corn, soybeans, and these crops, sugarcane, have, clear value. The materials that we can make from them, we're very clear that we can produce a lot of things. We haven't scratched the surface on so many of these other crops, plants, and other materials. And I think that's key to us, is we know there's attributes in these plants that are probably unique in some cases, and certainly not what you could find in other places. And we'd love to work with green chemist researchers. We're clear about a lot of the crops that we know are good for the land, or good for rotations, good for farmers. So how can we look at some of these feedstocks as potential green chemistry feedstocks, these crops green chemistry feedstocks, and work together to see how we can make value for these crops in a way that farmers want to bring it into a crop rotation because they've got a good market for it. So I think we're bioplastics and green chemistry is moving up so quickly, and is expanding so quickly, that I think we're at a point where I'm hoping we can move beyond these first generation feedstocks and start to look at some of these other more beneficial crops and plants that really could both create really unique materials and really valuable materials, but also add huge value to the farmers, farm planning system. So it would be great. That's great. Do you have any feeling, I said that was the last question, but then I thought of another one. Do you have a sense of where feedstocks from algae fit in? Is that a viable area? You read about things from time to time of vats of algae percolating away as a means of generating feedstocks. Does that seem realistic to you? I think it's probably eventually realistic. We're very early stages, and it's kind of like our cellulosic biofuels that were, 5 years away for the last 20 years. Well, they're now here. We do have them now, and they're being produced commercially. Algae is similar, and from my understanding, again, I'm no expert completely on it by any means, but I've talked to a lot of folks who've worked in the industry and said, there was early enthusiasm that we could just have huge, production and out in the desert and all this stuff. And as it turns out, it's not quite as easy as we hoped. And, the stuff that grows the best also has lower value. The stuff we want the most is the most tricky to grow, and so I don't doubt they can figure it out and that it will have a role to play in the future. But at this point, I think it's still very early stage.
Thank you so much. That has just been a terrific presentation.